Hello, I'm David McHale, Communications Specialist for the United Nations Capital Development Fund, or UNCDF, and welcome to the second episode of our limited series that we are producing with our fantastic colleagues at UNTV. We are using this series to focus on the topic of municipal and local finance, the challenges that municipalities in least developed countries face when it comes to accessing international capital, and why it is so important to change this ecosystem, in particular to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, in our first episode, we focused on how the existing global financial ecosystem prevents local governments from accessing capital in international markets. For this episode, we are going to discuss how this ecosystem needs to change, and for that matter, our vision for that change. And today we are joined by a fantastic thought leader, David Jackson. David is the director of the Local Development Finance Practice of UNCDF, which is a center of excellence and an innovative fund for local government finance and local economic development finance in the world's 47 LDCs. David, fantastic to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you.
So let's just get to it. As I mentioned in the first episode of this series, we were focusing on the challenge, and Jaffer Machado did a great job of explaining exactly why municipalities and LDCs have such difficulty accessing international capital. But before we get to that kind of root discussion, let's take a step back. Talk about the importance of having a local municipal focus when it comes to SDG achievement. Why is it important to focus at the local level?
Well, David, because for many SDGs, we cannot achieve them unless we actually do that.
Right.
I think people talk about the SDGs in general, but when you look at them and drill down on what they are specifically, and then you look at your daily life, you will see that for many of the SDGs, it's actually the local government, it's the city or the provincial government that is the entity that is responsible and accountable for making meaningful change in these areas.
Right.
So effectively, I mean, the road to the SDGs is not an elevated highway on concrete pillars. It's actually a single lane track that winds its way through every town and village. And that is true just as much in the rural areas as it is in the urban areas.
Sure, sure.
I mean, just to give you some examples, if you look at issues like water.
Yeah, great example.
Issues like women's economic empowerment. This is where local governments are effectively the entities that are accountable and responsible for delivering those services. But most importantly, the existential issue of climate and environment.
Okay.
Because we will not survive on this planet unless we address the issues of climate change and environment, the plastics. The way we are destroying this planet can only be stopped local government by local government, city by city, village by village, town by town. Legislation at central government level will not do it. The private sector can play a part, but that will also not be enough. It's only going to be local governments taking their local environments into their own hand, using their land rights, using their policies, their influence, their contracting and procurement abilities, their public money, and working with their local private sector to save the planet. And that is not hyperbole, that is actually reality.
So that actually, since you brought up climate change, I'd love to hear just from you, why, in your view, do you believe that local governments are particularly positioned to drive climate action? But then at the same time, what are the challenges that are preventing them from doing so?
Right. I mean, when we're talking about climate action and local governments, we're talking largely about adaptation, firstly. So I think it's important to understand that whilst the Paris Agreement tries to limit global warming by 1.5 degrees, the global scientific community now accepts that it's too late. Global warming will...
It's too late?
It's too late.
Okay.
Now, that is the consensus of the IPCC.
Right.
It's too late. So we have to adapt.
Right.
So in South Korea, for example, every local government is obliged to factor in a 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, and every investment, public or private, factors that in. Many countries are not doing that. So they're actually building and carrying out activities that will leave them vulnerable in the future. So local governments are key to adaptation. When it comes to issues like plastics and renewables, again, local governments are key to creating the environment for bio-waste, and for environmental protection. Now, when it comes to climate mitigation, of course, there it's all about the big carbon emissions. But local governments can also play a role in their procurement of clean energy and things like that. But essentially, when it comes to adaptation, that is where local governments have the added value. Now, what is stopping them from doing that?
Thank you.
I think largely climate finance is centered around ministries of environment, which are traditionally regulatory ministries.
And that's at the central government
level. That's at the central government level.
You.
And they are traditionally responsible for regulations. They're not implementers.
Right.
So they've become bloated and fat implementing these huge projects where, in fact, it would be far more efficient and effective to mainstream that through local government action. And that's what many local governments are doing around the world. That's one of the obstacles. A second obstacle, of course, is the way that the private sector is not yet picking up the challenge of climate adaptation and not yet working with local governments and local mayors to address that.
That's fascinating. And I'm happy you brought up finance, because that dovetails nicely into really the core of this series, which is how do we unlock capital, how do we unlock finance for municipalities, particularly in LDCs. I'd love for you to talk about the work that you started, really spearheaded last year in Malaga, about starting the process of changing this financial ecosystem so it can be friendly in terms of finance flows to LDC municipalities. Just take us on that journey that started last year in Malaga.
Right, so last year in Malaga, we met with United Cities and Local Governments and with many other people from ministries of central government, from central government ministries, from local governments themselves, and experts in the area of local government finance. And United Cities and Local Governments represents all local governments globally, and they are the entity that brings local governments to the national, and international stage, to the UN, in fact. And what we realized is that the global financial system, it works well for large companies such as Amazon, who can move capital around and not pay tax.
Right.
It works well for it works well for central governments because they have a monopoly of taxation. They can borrow with a sovereign guarantee and they can access capital relatively cheaply. But you have the paradox. A large city in a small developing country such as Benin, so Cotonou, the capital of Benin, has to deal with all the problems.
Right.
But Benin, the country, has access to the capital. Now Cotonou, because it's the largest city and because of the politics, often the mayor of Cotonou may be the next Prime Minister or President of Benin. Sure. And you have always political issues there. Central government's not necessarily wanting to empower local mayors. You have a paradox that the entity in Benin that is responsible for fixing the problems is the entity that does not have access to capital. That was what inspired the coalition. Now, through the work of the coalition, we are driving access to capital to local governments in, I think, 3 big ways.
Great.
The first big way, and this is important, is for central governments not to see local government access to capital as a zero-sum game. Okay. And this will require some regulatory change as well at the international level. So currently, if a local government borrows on the international capital market, that counts against that country's debt ratio.
Debt ratio, right.
Right. So there has to be some way for central governments to see that local government borrowing actually meets, or if it's for the right purpose, can meet and can be the most effective way of meeting a national development priority. So not to be jealous of a local government that's borrowing, but to encourage that, because that will actually build resilience of that country's economy and that country's environment.
Sure.
The second way is for central governments to see, particularly in developing countries, that creating a domestic market for local governments to borrow is a win-win.
Sure.
Not only because the local governments borrow domestically, therefore it doesn't affect in the same way the debt ratio, but also because it's a deepening and broadening of capital markets in general, which actually creates more economic diversity and depth.
Sure.
So they have to look at that in a new way.
Right.
And thirdly, for central governments to understand that in all cases, including in the richest countries in the world, transfers from central government to local government are a key part of
fiscal
local
transfers.
Thank you. Yes, public money, if you like, whether it's New York, whether it's London, whether it's Paris. That is also a big part of local government finance.
Sure.
So developing countries should not think that as they get richer, they can stop making these fiscal transfers to local governments. No, they should continue in more or less the same proportion, because that will always be a key part of local government finance. But they should not, again, see this as a zero-sum game.
Sure.
It's not wasted money. It's money that actually drives your national development priorities.
Sure.
Because you will not be able to deliver your national development priorities without local government finance. So that's the paradigm shift that countries need to see.
Thank you. Thank you for using the term paradigm shift. I think as we go into the final question, I was thinking of the term zeitgeist,
Right.
Zeitgeist paradigm shift. But to that point, what are the indications that you're seeing that prove to you that, in fact, this paradigm shift is possible?
So let me give you an example from a rich country and a poor country.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, in the case of Los Angeles, the mayor of Los Angeles has a plan for 100% renewable
Mayor
energy.
Garcetti.
Yes, that's
Thank you.
right. A plan for 100% renewable energy.
Right.
He's pushing ahead, and he will get there.
Yeah.
They have the means to do it.
Yeah.
Now, in the case of Mwanza in Tanzania, for example, they have now realized, and the central government has also realized, that Mwanza will not be able to develop without an expansion in the capital market. And central government has stepped in to encourage a bond market in Tanzania. In the case of Bangladesh, central government has also realized that, and they've allowed cities now to borrow on the corporate bond market in the meantime, whilst a municipal bond market is created.
Well, it's getting created.
So
right.
cities will create a special purpose vehicle, which is effectively a company under private company law, but owned by the city.
Right.
And that company will borrow on the domestic corporate bond market,
Right.
which deepens that market as well. So it's happening, change is coming. And just finally,
Please.
of course, Bangladesh is one of the countries which is most at risk from climate change. It's one of the most densely populated countries in the world. It's one of the most lowest lying countries in the world. And unless those cities can build that infrastructure, can protect themselves from their climate change, there will be no Bangladesh.
Right.
And I think central government has now realized that local governments are the key to Bangladesh's future, and they're investing in that.
That is a remarkably powerful and thoughtful way to end really an insightful conversation. David Jackson, thank you so much for giving your time and your thoughts, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David.